The truth is, most things, 99.5% of things in your life, it's fine for it to be just good enough. But occasionally, if you decide something's really important to you, I feel like the only standard to shoot for is to try to do it the best it's ever been done.
Hey, this is episode 1 of Good Work. My name's Barrett Brooks. I'm your host. This is the first episode of my new podcast made up of long-form conversations with talented people who are using their careers to make the world a better place. In this first episode, I wanted to invite someone onto the show that I both knew really well and had a lot of mutual trust with, and that had name recognition. The trust was so that we could go deep and they would immediately have a great conversation with me. And the name recognition is, well, so that you would listen. James Clear is my first guest today, and I've known him for over a decade. The thing I love most about James is that despite all of the runaway success he's had at this point, I mean, his debut book, Atomic Habits, has done over 20 million copies sold so far. He was the best-selling author on all of Amazon in 2023. He beat out Prince Harry and Britney Spears for that honor. Despite all of that success, James is still a thoughtful friend, a loving husband, and a doting father at his core. Those are the things that matter most to him. And even as he's achieved all the accolades, all of the recognition, he stayed true to who he is and stayed close to the people who are with him along the way. Now, you can hear James interviewed probably hundreds of times across the web at this point. So I wanted to take a different approach to this. And I wanted to find all the little questions that I would want to ask if we were having dinner together about how he became the type of person capable of making a massive impact with his work, the type of person capable of writing one of the best-selling books of the past decade. So this is episode 1 of Good Work with Barrett Brooks. I hope you enjoy it. I thought that we would start with hopefully something a little bit surprising for folks, which I know plenty of people will have seen before, but most people might not realize is you have a PS in every newsletter. And the PS, I think, of the whole thing is the most reflective of your true personality.
It's probably true.
So I would just love to hear, it's been there all along, I think, and I have some hypotheses about where it came from and why it's there, but just tell me the story of where the PS came from in the newsletter.
A little bit of context. For the first couple of years that I was a writer, I would write a new article every Monday and Thursday. And it was really that writing habit, doing that for the first 3 years, that kind of launched my career and set me on this path that ultimately led to the book deal for Atomic Habits and the book coming out and so on. And then the book launched and things went really well. And suddenly I didn't have nearly the amount of time that I had before. And I was like, well, I don't want to just let this audience go dormant and not communicate with them. I really came to value the interactions that I had with readers. And so I was looking for a new format. So Atomic Habits comes out in 2018. In 2019, I decided to switch to this format called 3-2-1. And it was 3 short ideas from me, 2 quotes from other people, and 1 question to think about for the week. I thought about the format for the newsletter for 7 or 8 months, I think, before I finally settled on something that felt right. I had bits and pieces that I liked. I knew I wanted to do 1 time a week, not 2 times like I had been doing previously. I also knew that my time was so compressed. So I had this question of, just hypothetically, could I create a newsletter that I could do in 1/10 of the time that I spent on the previous newsletter? But it wouldn't be 1/10 as good. It would be just as good, that people would get just as much value or usefulness out of it. And I had to think that sometimes I like playing little mind experiments like that with myself and being like, look, just of all the possibilities in the world, do you think there's one out there that could do that? And I think there could be. And so then I'm like, well, now my job is just try to figure out what that is. Whether that's true or not, I think there probably are some readers that prefer longer form stuff. But I do think generally the newsletter's done really well. A lot of readers find it really valuable to have this short format rather than the longer articles. So that's been good. But one thing that I lost when I switched to that format, I lost some of the articles that I would write each year that maybe gave you a little bit of a lens into who I was. I have never been the kind of writer that would share very much about my personal story. My publisher had to push me so hard to include my personal story at the beginning of Atomic Habits. I didn't want it in there. And eventually she was like, listen, this has to be there. I always feel like I'm writing about things that are interesting to me and that I find genuinely helpful for my own life. But it's not supposed to be about me. Like, I can be at the center without being at the center. It's always going to be about me because I write it. I did the work. But what I really care about is it useful for them? Does the reader really value it? So I would prefer to just make it all about, here's practical strategies that you can use to, make progress in your life. Occasionally, I would do something a little different. Like each year I would publish an annual review and I would talk about what went well or what didn't go well. One time I wrote an article about failure and what I do when I feel like giving up. And so it was all about projects that hadn't gone well for me. Much to my dismay, whenever I write about those things, the audience really likes it. And so I don't like sharing some of that personal stuff, but they find it interesting. And so I've always been trying to find a balance between my preference for not sharing much about my personal life and connecting with the audience. And if you look, you can notice that I still do some things that are very weird. Like my Instagram, there are no pictures of me. It's a very odd feed. It's just like texts and quotes. It's a really weird Instagram feed. Or like my profile images on social media, you can't see my face. And all of that is pretty intentional. Like, I'm not trying to be out there as a brand or as a person. I always feel like the brand is the work that you do and the value you provide. And whether me as an individual am publicly visible, I'm not really that interested in that. So I do a lot of weird things with the business in that way. And when I switched to the newsletter format, I kind of lost one of those connection points that I had. So this is a very long-winded way of saying I added the PS because I was like, well, I shouldn't be so damn serious all the time. Like, it should be a little bit fun. And you should be able to see that, I'm not just a robot who writes about habits all the time. I have a little bit of a personality. So I decided that I would do 3, 2, 1, and then I would add a PS. And the PS would just be a joke or a meme or some dumb, stupid, or interesting thing that I thought was engaging or entertaining or funny. Yeah, now the hilarious thing is it's the most clicked on link in every email that I send. But
I was going to ask that. I wondered how many people. Yeah.
So that's the origin story of the PS statement in 3, 2, 1.
As I read through the newsletter, the thing that struck me was and you've said this in other interviews, that so much of your work is a reminder to yourself about what you've learned.
Yeah.
It's a reminder to continue practicing the things that you believe are good for your career and for your audience and for the things that you're trying to achieve.
At some level, all of it is that. I mean, at some level,
right.
All of it is a reminder to me and to try to pull my mindset back to center or to focus on the things that I feel like I'm not focusing on enough. 2 things are true here. One, if you know what's going on in my personal life, you usually get some indication of why that's in 3, 2, 1 that week. So it's often based on that, what I'm dealing with personally or the people around me. But then the second thing that almost always is true is whenever someone comes up to me and they're like, is that thing in 3, 2, 1 about me? It's almost, it's basically never about that. I don't think I've ever had that happen where someone correctly guessed that they were the inspiration for it. But the things going on around me are often the inspiration for it. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I feel that. It's like after a coaching session with the client, I think about what's the universal here? What's the universal takeaway? And how can I write about that or share it with others in a way that resonates? And it's the same kind of thing with your newsletter. But I think so many people would assume, and often do assume when I hear them talk to you, oh, he's got it all figured out. He's doing all this stuff and he's the expert. And so much of your message has continuously been no, actually, I am figuring it out. And that is what I'm reflecting in my work. Mm-hmm. And so I read it I read the body of work from 2 points of view. One was just, I enjoyed it. And I texted you at one point and it was like, hey, I get why we're friends because we're interested in so many of the same topics. But the other was almost as this kind of love letter to yourself in a way, this way of communicating with yourself, whether it's this older, wiser you, this imagined older, wiser you communicating to current you or something like that was just what kept running through my head. And it just gave me so much compassion and connection to you as a human being when I read it that way.
I think you could say it's, whether it's older or wiser, I'm not sure, but you could say it's when I'm at my best, I'm acting like this. And most of the time you're not at your best, but that's okay. It's supposed to be a reminder to yourself. So there's definitely a lot of that. I think your point about this assumption, there's definitely this thing that happens. You publish a book about habits. Everybody kind of assumes you have your habits dialed in. But your point about he doesn't have it figured out. What you're reading is me figuring it out. And that is definitely true. When I was writing Atomic Habits, I was lamenting to my publisher. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, writing this book is just wrecking all my personal habits. And she said, like, we write the books we need, and that, I think that definitely describes my experience. I was interested in the topic because I needed it. I try to write about things that I also practice or that I've had to live. I feel like it makes the writing better. I mean, it's a certain amount of work to have a well-researched, well-informed opinion, but ultimately anybody can have an opinion, and it's something different to practice it. And so I think the fact that I had to build writing habits to write the book, or that I had to build exercise habits to get in shape, or I had to build certain business habits to create the business and run it effectively. The fact that I had to practice those things, I think ultimately made the work better. And also the fact that I have struggled to practice those things made the work better, because then I knew what it was like to fail in a certain sense, or I knew what it was like to try a strategy and not have it work out. And so all of that, I think, bleeds through in the writing in some way.
Yeah, I feel that for sure. So I am of two inclinations here. There are these two questions that I realized I've been toying with my entire career. And one of them is, what is it that allows people to fully realize their potential? Like, why are some people able to exercise so much of their potential as compared to others who never really take off? And then the other secondary question that is conditional on the first is, why is it that some people then use that potential to the great benefit of others, even when it's not always in their self-interest? Like, why do some people choose to try and make an impact in the world? And that's probably a little bit of a false dichotomy, in that it's always in your self-interest if you're doing something for some reason. It's like, well, it builds their ego up, or it serves their idea of what a good person is, or whatever. And so I guess the premise of this show is like, well, let's seek the answers to those questions. Mm-hmm. What allows people to reach their potential, and why do some people, the people on this show, use that to do good in the world? You've always been a person focused on problems that are important. Even listening back to our conversation so many years ago, you were thinking about the healthcare system and how that was broken and what you could do about it, but going about it in a very kind of uncommon way, in a orthogonal way that was like, how do we actually create change? Not just how do we follow the well-trodden path to get there. So I'm interested in going two directions here. One is maybe looking back at some of the pivotal moments of your life that have helped build you into this person capable of thinking this way and doing this kind of work. And the other is we could just talk about the work and see where that takes us. So I'm curious just which one resonates with you more.
Let's do the inflection moments in life.
Okay. So, the beginning of your book, it's interesting that you said that the publisher really pushed you, right? And this is the one moment that I've heard you talk about repeatedly, because it's in the book. It's like, okay, you had a massive concussion, brain damage, all of this stuff from this baseball injury. But it's obviously not the only moment that's been pivotal. There's been so many along the way. So I'm just curious, like, if, let's say we're going to pick three, the three most pivotal moments that have made you the kind of person capable of doing the type of work you do today. What's the first one that comes to mind?
So let's zoom back just for a second before I answer this. You said a couple minutes ago, I'm interested in, finding out why is it that some people fulfill their potential and, make the most of their opportunities and contribute something meaningful and so on. I think there's a very easy answer to that, and there's a very complicated answer to that. So the very easy answer is, the reason some people do it and some people don't is because of how people direct their attention. And people who direct their attention well and in productive ways into things that are meaningful and make a big impact, make the most of their potential. And people who don't, despite how much intelligence or talent or ability they may or may not have, don't make the most of it. So that's the easy answer. But then there's a very complicated answer that cascades from that, which is, why do some people direct their attention in that way and why do others not? And what life experiences lead you to that and what choices lead you to that and so on. So that we can kind of unravel that tangled question as we talk through this. But I think, obviously the one that I can speak best to is my own personal experience. So if we're looking for some inflection points in my life, in terms of my creative work and the business, first inflection point is probably somewhere between 8th grade and sophomore year of high school. And I have this backdrop of growing up in a normal middle-class family, but with the great fortune of parents who were very supportive and positive, and also grandparents who had really good mindsets. I think I have heard this from a couple different people now, so I'm just sort of repeating back to you what I've heard from some friends. And I do think it's true, but I don't know that I would have said it until I was told it by other people. But I've had a couple people tell me now that my internal monologue is really good, that I have good self-talk, however you may define that. And I do think now that I've heard it from people that is probably true. I didn't know that there was another way to be, right? Like I just thought that this is how people are. But I try to not be my own bottleneck, to not talk myself out of things, to not be the one to tell myself no. I try to let the world tell me no before I tell myself no. And I think a lot of that internal monologue and mindset came from the people that I was raised by, and just sort of the luck and the benefit of being raised in a household like that. Now, I picked the first inflection point as somewhere in that like 8th grade to sophomore year range, because I would say that was when that mindset first started paying dividends for me. And I started to have a couple small wins that I think you could roughly draw a line from in my 8th grade year, maybe my 6th grade year, to 1 or 2 years out of college, where it felt like I was on an upward trajectory every year. And it wasn't that I was like I was never the best at it. I was never like the fastest on the team or the best player or anything like that. I wasn't the valedictorian or getting the best grades, but I was improving every year. And those little feelings of momentum, I think, made an enormous difference in my life. And I would say some of this is maybe I just had the benefit of some of those things happening, but I would say most of it actually was not that. Most of it was the fact that I chose to direct my attention to the things that were wins at the end of each year. I remember at the end of each baseball season, I would sit on the back porch with my dad, and we would talk about my best performances that year, what went well, how I got better from the year before. It was never a negative conversation. It was just trying to remember the things that went well. And then I would do the same thing kind of naturally with school. I would think about the good grade that I got on a test, or how I performed really well, or said something that the teacher praised in class. And these are small moments, but by getting to the end of the year and having a few things that you can hang on to, that momentum starts to build. So I'd say that's the first inflection point. And the reason it was so big is because it started to fuel my confidence in myself that I could do things and I could improve, and that I wouldn't be my own bottleneck, that I wouldn't talk myself out of stuff, that I could figure it out along the way. So I think that was a big moment.
So it brings to mind a couple of things for me. The first is that, there's this idea in psychology that so much of our inner voice is really just a reflection of the voices we got when we were developing, when we were young, your parents, your grandparents, your caretakers, whoever. And so I immediately went to, our roles as fathers, which we don't have to get off on right now. Maybe we will eventually, but I think so much about that for my kids, my two boys, and what is the voice that I'm giving them when we're doing anything. We're building a marble run together, or when we're reading books, or even when I'm mad at them. And it's so interesting how that can shape us. And so the second thing that brought to mind for me was twofold. One, my experience in the same kind of thing. So we both played baseball growing up. And after every game, I have this memory that sticks with me so much that was basically, we'd get in the car, and we could have won. I could have played a great game. Might have been, 2 for 4 and made a bunch of plays at shortstop or whatever. That's 500 in baseball terms. Come on, we're doing it, right? What I remember is just talking about how I could have been better. Where did I not quite get it right? That walk that I had, the error I made. I have spent the last decade of my career. The reason I think that I needed a decade between my first business and the business I run now was I had to go inside and try to figure out, how do I reorient this voice that is there to who I actually am today, not to the voice that I had from long ago. And, it was all well-intentioned. My mom is just a very improvement-oriented person. That's the way she directed the conversation, for good intent. And so that leads me to think about all the times I read in your newsletter where you say, try to focus on the praise and the kudos and whatever else more than the criticism. There's these trends in your newsletter over time, and that's one of them. And I'm just imagining whatever was the trigger for that and those newsletters of maybe there was this one little negative thing that came back your way, and it's why would I spend so much energy on this?
Yeah.
But I wonder if you're also just wired that way, that you are able to shed it a little faster.
It's so hard to know what's personality, what's genes, what's, upbringing. I don't know that I can fully parse through it, but I was just talking about this the other day. We have little kids now, and it's funny talking to your parents about like, what was I like when I was 3, and like getting there. And it's hilarious hearing some of their memories from 35 years ago. They only remember the positive things. They like, basically, my mom's like, I don't know if you guys ever had tantrums. Like, okay, that's obviously not true, right? But I don't know. It is interesting. My parents are kind of biased in that way. They like remember the good parts. There can be downsides to that too, but I generally think if you're going to be a certain way, that if you're going to lean one way or another, that sounds pretty good to me, to remember the good parts. So I don't know how much I got of that from them, from upbringing or from genes or whatever, but I definitely seem to have gotten a fair amount of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And just hearing you talk about that with your dad too at the end of the season makes me think about your annual reviews and how they're just a reflection on what have I accomplished? How have I grown?
I want to double click on that point you made a minute ago about like, what are we teaching our kids? Like, what kind of mindsets are we passing down to them? My wife said something really interesting the other day. She was like, you can't have a weakness as a parent and not expect that to not be passed down to your kids. If it goes unaddressed, it's going to get passed along. And we don't only pass along our genes, we also pass along our way of being and our way of thinking. And it really gives you an interesting way of thinking about self-improvement and like why it's important for you to address some of these things and not just let your weaknesses fester. And one of the surprises for me in my, short time being a parent has been how much of parenting is actually diagnosing and treating yourself, not the kids. It's reprogramming your own beliefs and your own mindset. So I've actually started to keep a little list of beliefs and ideas that I want to make sure I pass down to them. I went ahead and pulled it up, so I'll just read you a couple of them. I really believe the climb is the fun part. And so I want them to take a hold of that. It often doesn't feel like the fun part because you're in the middle of trying to make the business work or trying to create the thing or whatever. It's so much work and you don't have it working yet. But I think you'll look back on it and be like, that was the fun part. I think about like my arc or trajectory over the last 10 years as an entrepreneur. I can remember the day that I got 100 email subscribers for the first time. We went out to dinner to celebrate. And now, I think 3,000 people signed up yesterday and I didn't tell anybody, I didn't even talk about it. So my point with the climb being the fun part is that the milestones matter, that you care about them. It's a celebration. It's fun to continue to improve. And so I also think it encourages you to not shy away from difficult things or from attempting difficult things because you realize that's where a lot of the magic happens. So that's one idea that I hope they can latch onto. Another one that I have come to believe more and more is that life does not reward intelligence, it rewards courage. You asked that question earlier about why do some people maximize their potential and others don't. The truth is a lot of the valedictorians get lapped when they get into the real world because they chose to focus on something different. And you'll find somebody who isn't as talented as you or doesn't have as much intelligence as you, or maybe doesn't have the same resources, but they're getting better results. And the reason often comes back to the fact that they had enough courage to get started. And courage is almost always in short supply. Now, just choosing to do it does not guarantee it'll work out, right? But you can guarantee it's not going to work out if you never get over the first step. So life rewards courage, not intelligence. Life rewards action, not intelligence. I think that's another one. One of the big ones, this comes back to that point I had earlier about having good internal self-talk, is to be a friend to yourself, to like who you are, and to believe that there are many ways to live a good life. Some people are they're convinced that if they stay single, they're going to have a terrible life, that they have to get married to be happy. And I want all my kids to grow up and be like, if you stay single, I still like who I am and I can live a wonderful life. And if you get married, you can have a wonderful life that way too. But there is no one way to live a good life. And I think you really need to have a certain level of comfort with yourself in order to not make decisions where you're starting to hope that somebody else will make you feel comfortable or somebody else will make you feel happy. I think that kind of healthy self-esteem is a really crucial thing.
I want to touch on that one real quick. So you hit on this a few different ways in the newsletter over the years. And one of the ways you framed it was that the quality of your relationships in life will be reflective of the quality of your relationship with yourself. That basically the worse or the less you love yourself, that's not really the way you frame it, this way I'm framing it, but the less you love yourself, the more negative dialogue you have, the worse your relationship with yourself is, the more tolerant you will be of bad relationships externally, because anything that's better than what's going on inside will be more tolerable to you. And man, if that was not just like a bolt of truth to me when I read it, it's like, yes, I have grown more and more intolerant of bad relationships as I have improved my self-regard.
If internally you feel like trash, you'll put up with a lot of shit because you're like, oh, well, this makes me feel a little bit better than if I just have to sit here with my thoughts. But if internally you feel healthy and good and you're like, I'm comfortable sitting in a room with myself, I can handle the internal monologue that I have and how I feel about life. Well, why would you let somebody in and treat you like garbage? Like that's not, I'd rather just hang out by myself for an hour. So it really sets a baseline for the standard that you will accept. And having that healthy internal self-talk, I think, puts you in a very strong position to end up with good relationships, because as soon as somebody starts treating you bad, you're like, forget that. I don't need to waste my time on this. I'm going to move on. Yeah.
We could go way off on a tangent on how to get there, but I want to come back to, I think you were going to share maybe one more of this.
Yeah, just that I have a bunch of them, but one other one is like something I want to be able to tell them when they're old enough to fully grok this is you're running your own race and it really is yours. It's not mine. It's not your mom's. It's not, anybody else's. And I think a lot of parents, for whatever reason, especially entrepreneurs, it seems like they have this dream of legacy. They want to like build this business to become something great and then be like, I could pass this on to my kids. And my feeling is maybe my kids don't want any of the things I'm creating. And if so, that's fine. I created it for me and because it benefited the people that I was working for, not because I felt like I should get to dictate where they get to spend their adult lives. And it really is their race. And I also, that point that I made a minute ago of the climb is the fun part. Well, if you just hand over some multi-million-dollar business to them, you're kind of robbing them of the fun part. Like what's great is for them to be able to create and make their own thing. Those are just a couple of the ideas that I'm writing down and thinking about. And at some point, hopefully I'll have a good list that I can share with them.
Yeah. So there's two things here, right? Because I think sometimes the point actually gets lost in conversations like this, where some folks might listen and say, oh, okay, yeah, let me start like taking notes on these things. And maybe they like those ideas and they're the same that they want to pass on. But the actual point of that is the having the list part.
Yeah.
It's like, this is you applying that strategic way of being to parenting.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how do I want to intentionally impart wisdom and ideas to my children such that they can live a good life on their own?
I think it's a great point by you. And I always feel like it's so unlikely that you would find yourself living in an ideal way or an optimal way. Pick anything in your life. What are the odds that the first way that you start to build an exercise habit is actually the optimal way to work out? Or what are the odds that the first thing that you tell your kids is actually the lesson you really want to impart to them? And it's just so unlikely that the first thing that comes to mind, or that you like stumble your way into the ideal result. I think I agree with you. The lesson is to have the list. The lesson is to have a process for reflection and review, and to sit and actually think about it carefully. Like, what do I really care about and want to impart to them? And then, try to find some ways to get those lessons across over the years.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing you bring up a lot is just that a way of being is much more impactful than a way of talking, or communicating ideas through words versus actions are very different. And ultimately children adopt their actions. I like my son as an example, something will happen. It'll be an accident or just like something will happen, has nothing to do with him. And he'll be like, my bad, Dad, my fault. And it's like, no, it's not your fault at all. Like it's actually had nothing to do with you. It was an accident or whatever. But here's the thing. I do that.
Yeah. He sees you taking credit for other people's faults all the time.
Exactly. I way overfunction in that way. And so a big part of my journey and my own like health and inner dialogue is really being clear about what's mine to own, because otherwise I'm going to burden him with that same shit his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to do that.
That's what I mean when I say parenting, so much of it is about learning to reprogram yourself, and it really is tricky because you've been living that way for your whole life. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I don't really want to pass that along.
Yeah. It's a great mechanism for self-awareness. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to come back to pivotal moments, but I want to read you a quote back that you quoted in your newsletter. And so when I think about like the mind of James Clear, I know that you're trying to make sure every word on the page is there for a reason. Like you don't want anything unnecessary, even though your nature is to want to be complete first and then to chop it down. You are like verbose, but you're very good at editing. You're one of the best self-editors I've ever met. So when you put a long quote in, I'm like, okay, there's a reason. And I love some of the long quotes you included. So this one is from an architect named Christopher Alexander, and I'm just going to read it real quick because I thought it was awesome. In my life as an architect, I find that the single thing which inhibits young professionals, new students most severely, is their acceptance of standards that are too low. If I ask a student whether her design is as good as Chartres maybe, she often smiles tolerantly at me as if to say, of course not. That isn't what I'm trying to do. I could never do that. Then I express my disagreement and tell her that standard must be our standard. If you're going to be a builder, no other standard is worthwhile. That is what I expect of myself in my own buildings, and it's what I expect of my students. Gradually, I show the students that they have a right to ask this of themselves and must ask this of themselves. Once that level of standard is in their minds, they will be able to figure out for themselves how to do better, how to make something that is as profound as that. Two things emanate from this change standard. First, the work becomes more fun. It is deeper. It never gets tiresome or boring because one can never really attain this standard. One's work becomes a lifelong work and one keeps trying and trying. So it becomes very fulfilling to live in the light of a goal like this. But secondly, it does change what people are trying to do. It takes away from them the everyday lower level aspiration that is purely technical in nature and which we have come to accept and replaces it with something deep, which will make a real difference to all of us that inhabit the earth. And man, even as I read it now, it's like it gives me chills. It gave me chills when I read it. It gave me chills just now. I want to know where your barometer came from. Like, where did you get your standard? What shaped that? Where did you first learn to set a standard like this? Like, who was your Christopher Alexander?
I guess it had to be my parents in some way, but some of it I think is also just how I'm wired. Jim Collins has that quote where he says something like, what were you encoded to do? And like, I feel like I'm just encoded that way. Like I read that quote and I'm like, this is the only way of being that makes sense to me. I love when he says like that you have a right to have that kind of standard be your standard. Like that is exactly how I feel about it. I don't think most people give themselves permission to be that way. But like I said, when I was working on Atomic Habits, at one point I came down, I looked at my wife and I said, I don't know, I kind of feel like this book like needs to be a book about all of human behavior. And she was like, all right, I think that's a little insane. Like that seems like that, you're probably like stretching it too far. I was like, okay, you're probably right. Like I need to come back to habits. But then I was like, okay, it'll be about habits. But I think what I should shoot for is that this should be the best book on habits that's ever been written. Even as I say that now, like it doesn't make sense to me to try to do something different than that. You have to be careful about how you choose those types of projects because you don't have enough time to do that everywhere in life. And I think the truth is most things, 99.5% of things in your life, it's fine for it to be just good enough. But occasionally, if you decide something's really important to you, I feel like the only standard to shoot for is to try to do it the best it's ever been done. Like, what does that actually look like in practice? So when I was brainstorming titles for Atomic Habits, I have a spreadsheet somewhere. I have like 300 to 400 titles that I brainstormed. Okay. So we're only going to pick one, but if we want it to be the best, then we need to brainstorm a lot of them. Or I did this thing, the final version of Atomic Habits has 20 chapters, but at one of the middle stages when I was working on the book, there were 12 chapters. And so I got 12 index cards and I wrote chapter 1 on 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, laid them all out on the floor. Then I went to my bookshelf and I grabbed every book off the shelf that was relevant to a particular chapter. And I stacked them all up. So I'd have like 5 books for chapter 5, 4 books for chapter 7, whatever. And I laid them all out. And then I looked down and I said, okay, my objective is to take everything that is genuinely useful in each of these books and distill it down into this single chapter and make all of these books irrelevant. That if you read Atomic Habits, you don't need to read any of these. Did I reach that standard or not? Who knows? Probably not. But by doing it that way, it was a way of striving to make it the best possible book on that topic. Your point about me being kind of verbose or coming up with a lot of ideas, but then editing, I think that is like a core feature of how I create. I would say it's like broad funnel, tight filter. People read Atomic Habits and they'll be like, wow, I can't believe how many great ideas are in here. And I'm like, you would never say that if you saw how many ideas I had to make. Like I'm very good at creating trash. I'll generate 1,000 ideas and then I'll cut 975 of them. And then the 25 that remain, you'll be like, oh, those are pretty good. I'm like, yeah, there are a lot of bad ones in between. And that's like my whole strategy for the creative process. but I'm willing to go through that amount of work because that's what I think it takes to try to achieve that standard that Christopher Alexander is talking about in that quote. A lot of books, this very common problem with business books, which is they should have been a 20-page article or a paper or PDF, and they get stretched into a 200-page book. And I was like mortified of having that problem. So the first draft of Atomic Habits was 710 pages, and I cut it down to a final draft that was 250. And I was kind of like, well, if one out of every 3 pages isn't good, then like I got a real problem, But those are all just different ways of trying to strive for that standard. And again, I don't think you can do it in most areas of life, but in the one or two where you decide it's really important, I just don't see how it's worth it to spend 3 years or 5 years writing a book, but then be like, well, I'm not trying to make it the best book ever on that topic. It's fine if it's just okay. Like that, to me, that seems like insanity. Like if I'm going to invest that much of my time in it, then I'm at least going to try to make it the best thing that's ever been made on that topic.
Yeah, I remember we were at a retreat, I think in Sedona, Arizona. And I remember specifically we were sitting on this L-shaped couch and we were talking about the book. It was before it came out. And we were having this conversation about, you share this idea repeatedly that like you are not entitled to the results of your work. You are only entitled to the inputs that will yield results of some kind. And then you have to let it go. You have to let it go once it's done because you can influence it, but you're not in control of that. Like you don't have the say in how it's received. Basically, you have the say on whether people get it, but you don't have the say in how it's received. And still back then, before the book came out, I remember having this conversation where you said something to the effect of, I am not set on this book changing my life, but I am prepared for the reality that it might fundamentally change my life. It was something like that was what you said. And I just remember sitting there like, man, I don't know how much cussing I'm going to do on the show, but it was like, man, this mother is serious. He has done the work to believe this thing could legitimately be at the standard that he expects. And he knows it. He's sitting here, he knows it. And he's saying it right now because he's amongst friends. And he would never say that publicly. And so, if you want to delete this, that's fine. But I remember thinking, yeah, that's how I want to be. I want to have done the work such that I don't control how it's received, but I know I did everything in my power to make it great.
It's interesting. I don't remember saying that, but I believe you. It's interesting looking back on it. Sometimes I kind of feel like I faked everybody out, that like I believed it and everybody else kind of believed it too. That at the time before the book came out, I had this really fast growing email list. And so everybody was kind of like seeing the trajectory, and everything that I was talking about with the publishers or with you guys or with other peers, it was focused on the hope of what could be, the belief of how big it could be. But I kind of got everybody to buy into that idea. And then we all sort of collectively somehow made it happen. It was like everybody was kind of convinced that like, yeah, I think it will be a big deal. And then somehow it magically did. But like, I don't know. It was interesting. Anyway, the point that I'm getting to is that simply believing in yourself does not guarantee that things will work out. But not believing in yourself is almost always enough to guarantee that it won't happen. And so you got to walk this fine line between being confident and being delusional. But I feel like if I'm going to lean one way or another, I'd rather lean toward believing it's going to work and then making an adjustment if it doesn't. Because if you don't believe it's going to work, then you're never going to take the steps necessary. The other thing that you realize, and this comes back to that quote about standards, is that if you start out, I think Christopher Alexander says this near the end of the quote, it does actually change how people act or what people do. So if you start out with the intention of, I'm trying to write a book that will be a category defining book, or I'm trying to write a book that could sell. This was one of my hopes for the book. This is like my big dream was I had 3 different levels. I said, baseline level, I won't feel like this was a failure if I can sell like 5,000 copies or 10,000 copies or something like that. But what I really hoped I could do is sell 100,000 copies in the first year. That was, I had told that to a couple people, but right before the book came out, I actually had one of them tell me like, that's a really high number. You know that, right? But that was kind of like my stretch. Okay. And then the big dream I had in the back of my mind was, what if it can sell 1 million copies ever? Like a big question here is timeline. 1 million copies, what, a year or over 20 years or 40 years? Like if you stretch it out and you're like, okay, what if I had 40 years to sell 1 million copies? Like, well, you can start to move you can start to move 25,000 copies a year. Like there's probably a way to figure that problem out. So anyway, those were the levels that were kind of in my mind. My point is, if you approach the process like that, or whatever ambitious thing it is that you have in your head, it changes the choices that you make. Like it changes how you go about it. So the person who's on that path is on a different path than the person who's like, well, I always wanted to write a book and I just wanted to finish it and get it out there. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine if you want to write a book for that reason, but it doesn't make sense to me to spend 5 years of my life doing it unless I'm trying to walk this path that, could lead to that outcome.
Yeah, we're not going to rehash it here because it's not really what the interview is about, but maybe in post I'll add a little clip from it. But I send every aspiring author that I work with or know the clip from your interview with Tim Ferriss where you talked about the strategy behind how you used advanced copies to try and get traction early. And the way you looked at different audiences that had this kind of like, not literal cult, but this kind of cult-like feel to them where they were very tight knit, where ideas would spread within a community, and you like segmented.
They had strong word of mouth. That was what I was looking for.
And so I'll just say, like, if you are interested in beyond just James doing the work to set a standard for himself and editing well and believing in himself and positive self-talk and all of that, if you want like the tactical, strategic mindset that he went in to promote this thing with, you should go listen to the interview he did with Tim Ferriss, where there's probably a 25-minute segment and you talk about promoting the book. And it was just like, this is the difference. You gave yourself a shot. So many people do the work and they're like, oh, I'm exhausted. I did it. Thank God. And then that's it.
I always feel like it's the author's responsibility to find the reader. It's not the reader's responsibility to find the author. A lot of authors who are better authors than I am or more literary than I am, but they just kind of feel like, well, if you're a really good writer, that should be good enough. The work is good. But the reality is it's not. And you need this mixture of great, compelling work and the willingness to get it out there. I always like kind of use the example of launching a rocket. It's like, to get the rocket off the launching pad, you need an enormous amount of thrust. And if you can propel the rocket up high enough, it reaches exit velocity and then it stays in orbit on its own. But if you don't give it enough of a push off the launching pad, it just crashes back down to earth. And a lot of books are like that. They have a big week or a big first month and then they crash back down to earth. But you got to give it enough push and have a great product for the word of mouth to stick and the book to kind of take over on its own.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're sitting here, so we're recording late 2023. And as of today, the book has sold over 10 million copies. It's the number one selling book ahead of Prince Harry and Britney Spears on all of Amazon this year. Most people say they're an Amazon bestseller, like if you just click enough categories, you get down to a category that the book is a bestseller. I'm talking about all of Amazon. It's the number one best-selling book. And, whatever, we could go off on a big line of questioning about like, oh, how does that change your life? And how much pressure does that put on the second book? But what I'm actually interested in is if we go all the way back to when you became a writer, the story that I've heard you tell before that I actually loved that I wanted to bring into this conversation, but I'd love to know if there's another moment when you really became a writer. You won a writing contest pretty early, like early college or something like that, maybe late college. And
grad school, yeah.
And it gave you kind of the stipend to be able to write for a while. So I wondered if that was like, looking back, if you feel like that was a big moment that shaped you becoming the kind of person who could write this kind of book, or if there's something else that's the origin story there.
I actually think that story tells you a lot about my mindset and approach. So I will share it here in a minute. But I think me becoming a writer was not a moment. It was a much more gradual thing. What I set out to do was to become an entrepreneur. And I still resonate more with that label than author or writer. Now I kind of have to admit that I'm a writer because I have the book and it's like a physical thing, but I still think about myself more as an entrepreneur. But anyway, yes, to your question, I was in grad school and there are a lot of little lessons in this. The first thing is I was in business school and they sent out an email to everybody in our class and they said, hey, there's this interesting opportunity. It's this essay competition for this conference that's in Switzerland. And you have to submit an essay. And if they pick you out of, if they pick the top 100 winners, the top 100 entrants get a free trip to Switzerland for the conference. Well, I played baseball through undergrad, so I never got to study abroad, and my family never traveled internationally or anything. And so I was like, man, I'd love to try. Like, traveling sounds cool. I've never done that. I was the only one that applied from our whole program. And I'm like, you guys sent the email to everybody. Nobody else did it. So there's just some kind of lesson in there, which is there's just opportunities sitting around everywhere in life. People didn't want it. Why didn't they want to do it? Because we're in the middle of the semester. Everybody had homework. Everybody's busy. They wanted to go to the game on Saturday and party. And, I want to do all those things too, but it was just worth it for me to find 10 hours in my week to write this essay. But then the next thing that I did was I poked around on the website. I was like, all right, this would be cool to go to Switzerland. How can I figure out how to, get selected for this? Well, the conference had been going on for a while, and they had the previous 10 years of winners. They had their essays posted on the website. So I downloaded all 10 of those and I looked through them and I tried to find some patterns. So they were all about the same number of pages. So I wrote down the word count for each one. I looked at how many references or citations each one had. I looked at the structure and how they structured the essays. And then I wrote an essay that had about that number of words, that had that number of citations, that followed a similar structure. It was about a different topic. The prompt was different each year, but I started by setting it up for success and what was already working. So that kind of reverse engineering, that's also a big part of kind of how my mind works. And so I don't know, there's maybe some little lesson in there. So anyway, I do the essay competition. They end up selecting me. I get to go over to Switzerland. So that was great. That was my first year of grad school. It's a 2-year program. So that was my first time going abroad. I thought I had a great time. So then I come back next year, same email goes out, same thing. Nobody else applies. I decided to apply. I had written the first one and I learned a couple things after that first year and I got selected. Well, the second year they pick a winner and I ended up being selected as the winner. So I get to go back over to Switzerland. The prize is $10,000. And this was in May. I was graduating in June. So I didn't have any money, but suddenly I had 10 grand that I didn't have before. And I was like, okay, so I moved back home to my parents' house, lived in their basement for the next, I think, 11 months. And I lived off that 10 grand. And that was what got me started as an entrepreneur. I think if I had never had that happen, I would have had a different path, but I think I still would have figured out how to be an entrepreneur at some point. But whether it was that year or whether it was get a regular job and then do it in 7 years or something, who knows? I don't know. But that was what got me in as an entrepreneur. I don't consider that to be the time that got me started as a writer. Although I did it, I kind of was treating it like an assignment in school still. And I wasn't doing it because I thought I sort of like writing. But what did happen over the next 2 years that followed is that I tried launching some products. I had this iPhone app come out that was a total flop. I think it literally made $17. And then I tried a couple other websites and stuff. And what I realized was that the reason none of these business projects were working is because I didn't have an audience. I thought if I build it, they will come. So I started a blog. And, Barrett, you were kicking around on the internet around those same times. Everything around that time was you need to build an email list if you want to have an audience. And I was like, okay, I don't even know what that is, but how do I start an email list? How do I get a blog going? So I started that and I was doing it so that I could build an audience to have a business. But this strange thing happened, which is the more that I wrote the blog posts, the more I was like, I actually kind of like the writing. And so it was sort of this gradual shift over the next 2 years where I kind of learned, hey, I actually sort of enjoy this a little bit. And I wrote about a bunch of things early on. I wrote about how to have better squat form in the gym. I wrote about the medical system in America. I wrote about habits and creativity and decision-making, all the stuff I write about now. And when I wrote about some of that other stuff, working out or medicine or whatever, it was kind of the audience was like, well, that's nice, but maybe keep it to yourself. But then when I wrote about habits, that was the thing where people were like, hey, I want to hear more about this. And so eventually I found the overlap between what I was interested in and what the audience was interested in. And then I started jamesclear.com and started writing about habits and it all kind of took off from there.
It's so interesting just how, Steve Jobs quotes are trite at this point, but the whole being able to connect the dots looking backwards rather than forwards is just so apropos. Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
I agree with you. You probably would have found a way, but there's always these it was a moment of luck. You got picked, but you did the work to prepare to be lucky.
I always feel like luck is like an open door. It's like an opportunity in front of you, but you still have to walk through the door. Mm-hmm. And so when you come across these open doors in your life, you still need to have enough courage to go in, even though you may not know what's on the other side. And you still need to put the steps ahead of, put your feet in front of each other to walk the path. But it was definitely a fortunate circumstance to have that opportunity to go to Switzerland and get the money and, get it started, be able to move back in with my parents. So anyway, you talked earlier about inflection points. We could say that the essay competition in Switzerland was an inflection point, and it certainly was in some small way. I think the bigger inflection point, this is one of the biggest ones in my entire life, was the choice to become an entrepreneur rather than to go into corporate America. That single choice has changed the trajectory of my entire life, probably. And so I would say somewhere early on, that 8th grade to sophomore year zone, that was when I first started building confidence in myself. That was an inflection point. I would say going to Denison University is where I went for undergrad, played baseball there, met my wife there. That was another enormous inflection point. And then I would say the choice to become an entrepreneur. Those three are probably the three biggest ones that have, set me on the trajectory that I'm on.
What's funny is now that you have been an entrepreneur for so long, you spend a lot of time in corporate America.
Actually, the book came out, did well. And then, I have all these speaking engagements. And so I've done anywhere between 30 and 60 a year for the last couple of years. My wife looked at me and she was like, I feel like you've been to a lot of corporations. Like, do you feel like you've learned something about corporate America or the big businesses since, the book has come out? And I was like, yeah, I've learned that they waste a lot of money. Like, why are they hiring me to come in? Like, you guys could have bought the book for $12. But what you start to realize is that companies don't hire speakers for that reason. They hire them for very different reasons. They hire them so that they can look at their employees and say, look how much we care about you. We brought this bestselling author in. Or they hire them so that they can have like a signature session where they can ask questions of you, not just read the book, where they can like get feedback directly related to the business model. Anyway, it's interesting, but yes, I have spent a surprising amount of time in corporate America for having intentionally avoided it at the start.
So we're about halfway through our time, a little over halfway through our time. And I really want to get to your creative process, kind of the inputs and outputs of all of that and how you work. But one of the topics I most wanted to talk to you about is marriage and fatherhood, because I feel like you're one of the people in my life who I most resonate with and can be on the same wavelength with about the importance of those aspects of our lives. And so I thought we might take a little detour into relationships, if that's cool with you, for a minute, because I think if we leave it to the end, people might just turn it off. And I actually think this might be one of the most profound things we talk about, as we did earlier with parenting. Maybe the strongest trend, I think, in your entire newsletter is on relationships. Just repeatedly, it comes back to relationships and relationships and relationships. There was a version of this interview that I thought about doing that would only be your own questions asked back to you from the newsletter. It didn't quite work because there's so much immediacy to them. But one of the ones that I wrote down related to relationships is, who belongs in your inner circle, and can you reach out to one of them right now? And you ask a version of that over and over and over, this idea of an inner circle and who are the people who matter, and how can you create relationships of longevity, not just always seeking something new. So maybe we'll just start there. Like, I'm curious to know, you have access to almost anyone that you might want to have access to now. You might have to work for it still, but you have a credibility marker given what you've done at this point in your career to get access to a lot of people. You could constantly be seeking new relationships, and I'm sure you do on some level, on like a peer level, but you also are very intentional about maintaining strong ties to people that have been in your life and with you throughout the journey. And I'm just curious, why? Why questions are horrible questions because they feel blaming. But in this case, I'm going to ask why. Like, you could do anything in terms of relationships, and you choose to invest strongly in people that have been with you a long time. Like, what shaped that for you, and why do you do that?
That's an interesting question. I think first, to your point about like, could get access to anyone, I don't know that I've fully learned that lesson yet. That's interesting. I think I'm probably, a lot of what I am doing is just inertia from what I've been doing. And, so like, I'm a slow learner in that regard. To your central question, I don't know. I kind of feel like, of course, like my response is basically, of course, which is not a good answer, but it's like, when you have clarity around something, a lot of people feel like what they need is motivation, but what they really lack is clarity. And when you are clear about something, it's not even really that much. The decision making it is easy. It's not even really that much of a choice. It is so obvious to me how much I want to be around my daughter that I'm like, I could give a rip about who I could contact through email, Like, of course I'm going to spend the time with her. Like some of it is just that feeling where the trade-off is so obvious that I'm not even really that interested. A lot of it though is that I don't like the feeling of being rushed, and I don't like the feeling of being fragmented in so many directions that I do things poorly. And this is a lesson I have to keep reminding myself of, but the reality is, if I tried to chase down all those opportunities, my attention would be so fragmented and my days would be so chopped up that I would just end up doing everything at a lukewarm level. And I don't like that. It's not how I'm wired. I want to do things well. So if I'm going to be a good spouse, or if I'm going to be a good father or a good son, then I need to make time for that stuff. And that means there's a lot of other stuff I can't do. And at least for right now, I'm comfortable with that. I think one of the worst things is to make a trade-off and to not be comfortable with it. To be like, oh, I need to be spending more time with my family, but then all the hours that you're with your family, you're thinking about how you should be doing something for work. Then you're losing on both ends. I don't have this stuff figured out. Like, I'm still learning it myself, but I think that's my initial response.
So I want to drill down a little bit here, because I'm guessing there's more to this even than maybe you realize. So I perceive there to be three kind of really important groups in your life. One is your family. And I think of all the people I know, you are as good or better at keeping the family the center of your universe. Like you actually live that way. And that part of your family includes your wife and her family and your parents. And so, it's like, yes, you're nuclear, but also the kind of one circle beyond that. And then there's a second group. It's like a group of old friends. We go way back. We've got a group of friends, some of whom overlap, but you also have college buddies and other people that have been part of your life for a long time. And then there's a third group of people where you do intentionally seek out, you talk about this idea of surrounding yourself with people doing the kind of work or the quality of work that you aspire to. Always being surrounded by that standard. That's
one of my favorite things, by the way. Is like when I find a creator where I'm like, oh man, I just love the way they're doing that. That's one of my favorite things, is to connect with people who are like that.
So maybe just talk a little bit about, you've hosted some retreats over the years as a way of connecting with people. You don't have to get into who was there, but just talk to me about the strategy and the intent behind those, and kind of what role they played and play in keeping your standard and keeping your motivation up.
Well, when I started out, I didn't have any entrepreneurs in my family. I didn't have any authors that I knew closely or, could look to. And I really had this sense of I don't really know what I'm doing, or what I'm trying. I know kind of vaguely what I'd like to do, but I don't really know what it would take to do that. There's this quote that I came across from Winston Churchill recently. I thought it was good. It basically, he says something to the effect of, sometimes it's not enough to do your best. You have to do what is required. And I thought that was such a lovely way of framing it, because this question of did you do your best? In theory, it's a great question. In practice, first of all, nobody ever does their best. There's almost always something more you could have done. But secondly, it actually, I think, gets used as a crutch or a defense mechanism a lot of the time. It's okay, chill out. I'm just doing my best. I'm doing the best I can here. It's the kind of thing you hear a lot of people say when they get a little bit of criticism or they haven't quite done, And I think if instead, rather than asking, did you do your best? Did you do what is required? I feel like that's a more honest framing of it. So anyway, my point is, I said I wanted to build this business and maybe write a book, but I didn't know what was required. I didn't really know what to do or what steps were needed. So I started looking around for other people my target was hey, are you 2 years ahead of where I'm at? I haven't written a book yet. Have you recently published one? I have an audience that's X size. Do you have an audience that's 2X? Or I'd like to get started doing something on, YouTube. Have you already done that before? And so I was just looking for people that were a little bit ahead of me. And I figured I could learn an enormous amount from those people, but they were close enough that they would say yes to the invitation and that I would still have something to provide. And so, of course, I invite people to this first retreat and I'm terrified, right? You think everybody's going to say no. And the hilarious thing is, I've never had someone say no. Everybody always says yes because everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants to connect and be around like-minded people and have a chance to talk about the stuff that's relevant to your industry and all that. So that was kind of the impetus that got me started. And then I would host these retreats and we would, Barrett, you've been there, before, but We would all have time in front of the group to talk about what we were working on. There would be some shared sessions where we just talk about what it was like to write a book or to build an audience or to, what do you do when you're in the middle of the book launch and all these things that are like idiosyncratic and niche to your particular industry. This funny thing ended up happening. Like I would almost always would be one of the most useful weekends of my entire year. I would get done with that and I have like 6 months worth of stuff that I would need to execute on. Before I started doing those, I would be like, I hope the book can do well, but it kind of seems like that's something that happens for people, but I don't really know much about how it happens. And then after you get done, you're like, selling 100,000 copies of a book is a lot of copies, but like I do actually know 3 or 4 people who've done it now. I am actually friends with some people who that's their reality. And so for the average person, it seems totally out of reach. But then for you, suddenly you're like, it's not that wild of an idea. Like these people did it and I know them. And so it helps, I think, reset your baseline for what's possible. And you see the path that they walked. You see the steps that they took that got them there. So anyway, those are all some of the reasons that drove me to do it and why I found it useful.
So you and I are both sports fans. We're both big college football fans, but I especially love the NBA. And I love reading, especially about the relationships in the NBA. And I'm convinced that the most grossly undervalued aspect of championship caliber teams are the relationships. And that sometimes organizations don't focus enough on the culture and the camaraderie, and they break these teams up over and over and over. And they're like, oh, if we just get one more player, we'll finally win. And sometimes it's a talent problem, but I think a lot of times it's actually a relational challenge. And I love reading stories that get into the nitty gritty of what teams mean when they say we want a couple vets around, like veteran players, people who have been around the league a long time. And I love reporters who will ask like detailed questions about what does that mean? Like, what are you doing for the rookies? And they'll get into it and they'll talk about like, well, I'm teaching them how and where to buy clothes so that they're not just wearing sweats into the stadium every day. I'm teaching them how to eat, who to hire to help them eat well. I'm teaching them how to structure their days to practice and get their practice in, their body work in, their training, all the things they need in order to have a long career. And you think about that and it's like, oh yeah, because where the hell else would these people learn that? Like you wouldn't. In college, there's a dining hall, and you go from that to you live in a big ass house because you're making millions of dollars. Now what do you do? So of course you need to know that. And the same thing applies for every profession. It's little things like, here's the blueprint for the first 6 months after your book comes out.
Yep.
Here's what you do. And you can't control how many copies get sold off that, but you can control whether you do the blueprint, and so it can't be overstated the degree to which finding the people who know the things you need to know is valuable in whatever you're trying to do.
Strategy and tactics matter a lot. The amateur doesn't really know what to do. The expert knows what not to do. And you get around those expert people, they save you a lot of time. You're not wasting your time trying to figure it all out on your own. You can just focus on doing the work and getting the results. But you're right. You're not entitled to the outcome, but at least you're walking the right path.
We both used to do sometimes a couple of these retreats a year with different groups. And now we both have kids. Our kids are about the same age. Mine are 4 and 18 months. Kids change everything about life, at least in my experience. And I'm just curious how becoming a father has changed the way you work.
So many ways. I'll zoom out for a second. One of the questions that I like to ask is, what season am I in right now? And I find that I'm a really slow learner in that regard. Especially when we had kids, I was trying to force fit my old habits into our new life for like a year and a half or 2 years. And it wasn't until I finally stepped back and was like, okay, stop being such a dummy about it. You don't have the same amount of time. I probably have about 40% of the working hours that I had before we had kids. That doesn't mean that you can't still do great work, but it does mean that you can't work the same way or that you can't do as many things. I think you really need to, this is all stuff we could just substitute the word I for, but I really need to narrow my focus and take on fewer projects if I want to still do them at a high level. Some of the things that I did they did work well and were clever adjustments. Like the example I gave was shifting the newsletter to 3-2-1. I went from writing articles that took me 20 hours to write to now I can do 3-2-1 in like 1 to 2 hours. And that's great. I need a lot of things like that so that I can make the business work. So some of that's just strategy, but a lot of it is prioritization and choosing to not do things. I came across this quote the other day where This guy who worked with Steve Jobs said, Steve Jobs was the most focused person I ever met. And one of the things that I learned from him was that if saying no to something so that you can focus on something else, if that doesn't feel painful, if it doesn't feel like there's a sacrifice in saying no, you're not doing it well enough. Because what most people are like, well, I said no to, I didn't watch YouTube, or I didn't spend much time, I didn't watch Netflix this evening, or I didn't, and it's like, okay, those are things that were kind of easy to say no to, but what's the stuff that's painful to say no to so that you create the space that you need to do the one or two things that remain at a really high level? That's kind of the mode that I'm in right now. And it's like a lesson that I have to learn over and over again. It seems like each day I have to like remind myself of that lesson. I'm always like 6 months behind on what I should be saying no to. I'm always on the hook for something where I'm like, why did I agree to this? I need to be better about that. So that's been a big change. I want to just say, I hope I don't sound too much like I'm complaining right now, because the reality is what I'm dealing with is the best possible outcome, right? So this is what I was working for, was for the book to go well and for the business to be in a good place and for there to be lots of opportunity. So that's great. But it is still a problem that needs to be managed. It's still something that has to be resolved. So the problems are so different now. For like 10 years, I feel like I was trying to say yes to every opportunity, knocking on every door, being like, hey, please, will someone pay attention? And then, now it's like almost overnight, it was like, hey, you all are paying way too much attention. Like, please pay less attention. I need a little more space, So it's just like learning how to manage that. So anyway, that's one big change. It's hard for me to parse through. Atomic Habits launched, and then, my kids were born like shortly after. And so it's hard for me to parse through what of this is kids and what of this is the book. I think this one might be more book related. It has become such a big thing. It's become such a like runaway freight training that I'm just trying to like manage it now and figure out how to like, keep everything running and make sure that I feel like I have a hold of everything. And so it's been a very strange period. Though I would say the last 5 years it's been a very gratifying period because a lot of people are finding meaning and value in the work. So that feels really good. So it's been a very fulfilling period. It's been a great financial period. It's been a really good period in terms of parenting and home life. It has been a very difficult period creatively. And I've really struggled to produce new things the way that I used to. And to be perfectly honest, I'm still figuring that out. While a lot of things are going very well at this particular stage, 5 years after the book, but it's still the best-selling book of the year, I'm still trying to figure out what the next thing is that I'm going to create. I have some things that I've built, like, we have this iPhone app that's coming out so you can track your habits, and it's got a lot of material from Atomic Habits and things that I've learned since then and so on. So it's not that I'm not making things, but it's just been so different than the way that I made them before. And I'm still trying to figure out how to operate in that kind of new reality.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about this, just the way that, like, part of the way that we've each designed the life that we live and the priorities we've chosen is so that we can have 40% fewer, or 40% of the working hours we used to have. I feel very lucky in that. I know you feel very lucky in that. Like, we can spend that time with family now.
One of the things that I got right was, to a large degree, was the sequencing of my career and how I did it. There was this period of like 6 to 9 months where, to finish Atomic Habits, I kind of refer to it as like a dark period. Like, I woke up, I worked on it for 12 hours a day. I went to sleep. I dreamt about it. I woke up the next day, did it all over again. And I just needed to like be fully immersed in that, where I was thinking about nothing else for like 9 months to finish the project and get it done at that level. I couldn't do that now. It's not possible for me to live a day like that now because we have the kids. And, that's fine. But I'm glad that I did that project in the period of my life when I did, because I got the sequence right in that way. And now I can write 3, 2, 1. I can do that and still have the family time. But there's just some things that are inaccessible from the current trajectory.
Yeah. I mean, the two things that, I would just reflect on there are, I had a similar kind of thing. My version of it was I built a company for 5 years, and a year and a half into my son existing, almost 2 years, I got out and sold all my stock, and that gave us some freedom that we didn't have before. The two things I take away from this is, if you're listening to this and you don't have kids yet, if you want kids, it's really hard to fully understand and appreciate how much your life changes afterwards, and how much your habits have to change, and how much your output changes. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but for me, the costs are much higher. Like, the cost of preparing for this interview, because this podcast is something I'm committed to, was I didn't do bedtime for a few nights because I needed the extra hours. And I'm not willing to pay that cost for a lot of things, you know?
Yep. It doesn't have to be that way. You could still work in the same way, but you just don't get to see your kids. So,
Right, exactly.
There's a new trade-off there that, like you could still do everything the same, but you won't be a part of their lives in the same way.
And a lot of people do. You read a lot of biographies and that is what they do.
I think there's a really important point to bring up here. So I'm almost finished with Sam Zell's biography. I think it's called Am I Being Too Subtle? But he was an enormous real estate tycoon and business magnate. And, I think at one point he was the chairman of 5 different companies on the New York Stock Exchange. Like he had an incredibly successful career. However, he was also married 3 times, and he says that he didn't really get to see his family for a large portion of that. And it wasn't until much later in his life when he was a grandparent that he started to feel like, oh, I want to be spending time with my family. I'm not mentioning this to criticize how he lived or what he did. My point is just that was the trade-off that he was willing to make for that. And I think the tricky part, and the thing that's worth reminding yourself of, is that there are 8 billion people in the world. And no matter what industry or what thing you are interested in, there are a lot of people in that industry, and you will probably find 1 or 2 who are willing to sacrifice everything else to be at the top of that industry. And if you spend your time comparing yourself to those people, but not making the same trade-offs, that seems like a recipe for disaster to me, because you're expecting yourself to have the outcomes that someone living a totally different life is getting. It's not to say that one way is right and one way is wrong, but it is to say that you should think about what way is right for you. And then once you realize that, you really have to look at the global picture of how you're living your life and not just one individual result. Because on any dimension in life, now, especially with the internet and Instagram and social media, whatever, you can find anybody who is better than you on that dimension. And if you spend all your time comparing individual dimensions and not your overall daily lifestyle, you're going to end up feeling like a loser in basically every area.
This is a version of choose your pain, which is another theme of things that you talk about and that I'm in my coaching work definitely is very present. You have to be aware of and actively choose the pain that you're going to embrace, because every path has pain.
This is something our mutual friend John, he said this to me one time where he's like, we try to think about how do we want to live our days, and then inside of that box, what is the biggest business we could build, or what is what's the most revenue we can make, or my version of it is like, I like draw this box around what I want my daily lifestyle to be, and then I say, how can I have the most impact possible, but only inside of that box. If it's outside of it, it's not a good choice for me. And I think a lot of the time, especially with business, people start by kind of having this base assumption of, how can I have the biggest thing possible? The goal is to grow revenue. The goal is for the business to be as big as it could possibly be. And instead, I think the first question you should ask is, how do I want to spend my days? And then once you figure out how you'd like to spend your days and what your lifestyle looks like, now you can figure out how to make the biggest business within how you want to spend your days. But you see all kinds of decision making where it's like, people will take a promotion because it's higher status and it pays them more money, but it actually leads to a worse daily lifestyle. And I think if you are already making enough money, to choose to make more money but live a worse daily life is a really bad trade. But you see people do it all the time. Anyway, so it's all just about getting clear about how you want to be spending your time, realizing the trade-offs you're making, and then I think shifting from this external comparison of you versus your peers or other people in the industry to just you versus you. And how can you spend increasing amounts of time doing what you want and feeling fulfilled, rather than spending all your time trying to figure out how you measure up to other people who are living in a totally different way.
Yeah. It's easy to say in a couple minutes together and so hard to practice. It's so hard. I just had a conversation with my own coach this week about, do I want to build a coaching company or do I just want to be a coach? Mm-hmm. And that drive is so strong to just do more, build the big version. Mm-hmm. And in that conversation, I realized like what I want creative output. I would way rather make a world-class podcast and publish my own, I publish books, but not with my name as the author. I want to publish, but like there's things I want to do, and building a company would directly take away from every one of those other things that I say I want. But it's way more comfortable because I've done that before. And, so like it's the same version, and you just have to, I have to repeatedly come back to like, wait, what am I actually trying to do here? So I don't get off on this path that's like, it's not irreversible, but you can get into spots that are really tough to get out of.
Yep. That question of what am I really trying to achieve here? It's a good one to keep coming back to again and again. It's also tricky because making more revenue, driving more, making more money feels good. Building a bigger business and having people praise you for the success and the growing employee headcount and all that feels good. And so it's not that there isn't benefit to that. It's just you need to decide what's most important to you.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to, before we get into kind of creative inputs and outputs, I want to spend a minute on picking a life partner and the ways in which, for both of us, our partners have been just vital to our trajectories in any number of ways. There's the practical, obviously, of like, how do we divide the total labor of this family? And then there's the more like philosophical of, the reason I laugh so hard at some of the jokes you make about your marriage and the PS lines and stuff like that is I think they are reflective of things that sometimes maybe feel like they're hard in a relationship, but that are actually necessary in order to continue to grow. So like having an anchor relationship that can reflect back to me who I really am, who I have been, who I am becoming. We say it as like, she keeps me humble, but in reality, like my wife keeps me centered. She helps me remain centered in what it is that I'm prioritizing and not get too far off base from my core identity. And so I'm just curious from your own perspective, like in what ways does that relationship with your wife fuel your ability to do your work?
Well, there's all kinds of practical ways, which are probably the boring answers, like you mentioned about, dividing up labor and taking care of the kids and giving me, some space to do a particular project or whatever. Or like, what about when I have to go speak at a company and travel for a night? I mean, that's hard on everybody, and it might be harder on the person who stays home and has to take care of the kids. There's all that stuff, but that's just kind of like straightforward logistical stuff. To a large degree, I get paid for the quality of my ideas. And that basically means, one, I need to have, my mind needs to be in a good place. So to the degree that a good partner keeps you sane and keeps you normal, so to speak, to the degree that they help you think through topics, like in all of those ways, really crucial. I think in the back of Atomic Habits, I have the acknowledgements, and I basically thank Christy and say, like, you played basically every role in the creating of this book. You were editor, you were potential reader, you were a therapist, you were, spouses, if you choose to be an entrepreneur and they don't choose it, they basically get all this stuff forced upon them that they never asked for, but they still have to bear it. And so that's a really important role to play, and not really one of their choosing. So there's I feel like entrepreneur spouses should get a lot of credit for dealing with that, because it's a roller coaster ride emotionally for anybody, and they have to feel a lot of those bumps and bruises.
On that point, my wife always jokes that she's going to start a podcast, and she might have been joking with Christy about this, that they were going to co-host a podcast interviewing life partners of entrepreneurs as just like a therapeutic outlet for talking about all the challenges of it. It'd be a great show.
Yeah. So anyway, there are all of those ways. There's also just this great outside perspective that someone who doesn't work in your industry can provide. Like I actually used this as an example when I was giving a talk the other day. So finish the keynote, we have a Q&A session afterward. Somebody raises their hand and they're like, how can we use, this to drive behavior, build better incentives with our employees and kind of like sculpt and drive the behavior we're hoping to see with them. Basically, their question, the way they phrased it, was like centered around different incentives or bonuses or things they could do. What they wanted me to say was to come up with some kind of behavioral hack or psychological trick that would get their employees to feel motivated without them having to give up very much. But what I actually said was, I've talked about this with my wife one time, and she said something really good. It came from someone who is not in our industry or doesn't think about behavioral psychology or incentives or whatever. And she said, listen, people basically only want two things. They want time and money. So unless you're giving them more money or you're giving them time off, all the other things are just kind of extra stuff. I think to a large degree, she's right. Like if you're trying to motivate your employees, you need to find a way to give them time or money. And that's a very obvious answer as soon as it's stated. But if you think about yourself, you're like, what do I actually want? You're like, well, I want more time and money, and people are going to optimize for what's in their best interest or what's in their self-interest. So anyway, that's just one little example, but there are many things like that where she'll say something and I'll be like, yeah, I'm probably overthinking this, like that's
yeah.
So,
I mean, the third I would add is like, I think Time and money add up to freedom and possibility. And I think the third one is love. I think people want love. And ultimately, to me, great cultures at work, they foster ways of loving one another insofar as that is appropriate at work.
Well, they want meaning and fulfillment too, which is maybe connected to this love point. I mean, people want to feel like the work they're doing matters. And for some people, if that belief is strong enough, they will forego the time and money for the meaning and fulfillment. But I also feel like, especially in this audience I was talking to, and I know this isn't like what you were trying to get off on, but every company in corporate America talks about how meaningful their mission is and how it makes an impact. And most of the employees are like, yeah, that's kind of bogus. We all know that what we're actually doing here is selling software.
No, this idea of love, though, I've been coming back to it over and over and over. And it's like, most people don't want to hear that because it's just, I don't know, it feels soft. Repeatedly, I just saw the theme of love in your work, whether it is truly finding a way to love yourself to begin with so that you don't accept things that are not good for you. Relationships, circumstances, whatever. I think partnerships in life with, for us, our wives or whatever arrangement people choose for their life partnerships are fundamentally about being loved and having belonging, regardless of the work that we do. It does not matter the output that you or I have because we already have love and belonging at home. And for me, at least, I'm not willing to sacrifice that for anything. I am not willing to do what Elon Musk has done because I don't want to live the personal life he has lived. And I embrace that. And so I'm going to do the version I can do while still maintaining that at home. And I just think that's an okay choice, I guess is what I want to say, is like, that's an okay choice too. And you can still do a lot of good from that framework. Okay. I want to get to, I want to talk about creative inputs and outputs. I read this quote one time. I don't remember who talked about it, but they were basically like, publish or share the byproducts of your existing workflow was the essential idea. And I'll have to go look it up so I can get proper credit for it. The concept was basically like, look, if you're reading books, share what comes from that. Write the tweets, write the book summary. If you take notes in the book, put them out on your website or whatever. If you are having conversations with people, jot down quotes, share those. And so just thinking about, for me, it's like I'm in coaching sessions already as a way to earn my living. That's great fodder for content that other entrepreneurs are going to care about. You're speaking at corporations, hearing the questions they ask. That's great fodder for thinking about how are big companies and people within them thinking about their careers and their habits. Anyways, what I see in the way you've structured 3-2-1 which is the primary output right now, so that you still have capacity for other bigger projects. It's byproduct. It's like you're reading and you're getting byproduct. You seek out speeches and then you publish the transcripts. Like, what a freaking brilliant thing to do. Why not? You went and got the transcript, just put it up there. So I want to talk about inputs first, is basically what I'm getting at with all of that. I mean, you had so many incredible quotes in the newsletter over the years about reading. What I was wondering is, for a person who primarily watches YouTube as their inputs, I wonder what quotes they would pull. I mean, surely there are some, but none I can imagine are as profound as these quotes about reading in books. So I'm interested to see if that changes over time. But anyways, this guy named Gene Roddenberry had this quote. He's the screenwriter and creator of Star Trek, and it's on books. I consider reading the greatest bargain in the world. A shelf of books is a shelf of many lives and ideas and imaginations, which the reader can enjoy whenever he wishes and as often as he wishes. Instead of experiencing just one life, the book lover can experience hundreds or even thousands of lives. He can live any kind of adventure in the world. Books are his time machine into the past and also into the future. Books are his transporter by which he can beam instantly to any part of the universe and explore what he finds there. I'll just pause for a second as narrator and say, like, the Star Trek references here are fantastic. Books are an instrument by which he can become any person for a while: a man, a woman, a child, a general, a farmer, a detective, a king, a doctor, anyone. Great books are especially valuable because a great book often contains within its covers the wisdom of a man or woman's whole lifetime. But the true lover of books enjoys all kinds of books, even some nonsense now and then, because enjoying nonsense from others can teach us to also laugh at ourselves. And he goes on a little bit, but a lot of what I think about in terms of family life and the sacrifices that come with it is like, I travel to facilitate now, and I travel to see my parents. My parents are aging. My dad is ill, and that's a choice we're making. Allows us to live in Portland, and have the beautiful life we have here and also to see family. But like, I'm not having a bunch of new adventures and life experiences outside of that kind of core of what I've decided to prioritize. And I think about how I continue to generate ideas and growth given that. And this quote gets at how much books can be fodder for continued growth. And this idea that I've had ruminating that you kind of get at in different ways is like, in some ways, what we think is the collected algorithmic processing that our brain does of everything we've ever taken in. And for me, that's hundreds of books. Books are the thing that has shaped the way I think today. It's what allows me to ask questions and host interviews and reference stuff. Okay, that's my little soliloquy to books. There's supposed to be a question because you're the interviewee here. The question is, what role do books continue to play in your own work? Do you feel as much of the love that this apparent love letter is in your newsletter to books? Like, does that continue for you?
I think I get the most depth out of them. What role they play is honestly probably a little bit less than what they were pre-social media. Social media, Reddit, just the internet in general, and Googling and finding old blog posts like that is increasingly a source of ideas for me. But I still think I get the best depth and the most high quality ideas from books. There are exceptions, but as a general rule, I would say that's true. But my overall approach to this is that almost every idea that you have is downstream from what you consume. And so if you want better, more creative, more interesting thoughts, you need better, more creative, more interesting inputs. And I had this moment where it was after I hit 100,000 email subscribers. I thought, man, now a lot of people are paying attention. Now it has to be really good. And so I told myself, I just need to spend more time writing. And so I did that for a couple months. And actually, I think the writing got worse, not better. And what I eventually realized is that writing is kind of like driving a car. And you need to like park the car at the gas station every now and then and fill up with gas. And the point of having a car is not just to fill it up with gas all day and never go anywhere. But if all you do is drive, you end up stranded on the side of the road. And so reading is like filling a car up with gas, and writing is like going on an adventure. If I really want to produce great stuff, I need a combination of both. And ironically, whenever I feel like I don't have anything compelling to say, what I need to do is not write, I need to read. I think that's my relationship with it. And I do think that the better your inputs, the better your outputs will be. My style of writing is I still need to produce a lot of output. And then I have this important process of refinement and editing that happens after that. But reading is the engine. It's the fuel that makes the whole thing go.
One of the things that's been interesting to me over the years is, we talk about what we read when we have the chance to rarely actually chat in depth. And the nature of our reading has changed quite a bit over the years. If we were to compare like the authors that we tend to want to quote more often, it's like we talk about Wendell Berry or Edward O. Wilson or Cheryl Strayed, or I was just texting you about Maggie Smith the other day. If you had handed 22-year-old Barrett a memoir of a Columbus-based poet who was writing about her divorce and being a single mother, I would have been like, what the is this? And for when Maggie Smith's book, You Could Make This Place Beautiful, hit my life this year, it might be the best book I've ever read. And so I have this growing appreciation for my ability to make meaning without someone telling me what to think. It's like she's just sharing her story. Wendell Berry is just sharing a perspective. It's like I don't have to adopt it wholesale. And so I'm just interested in how has your reading habit changed over time? Like, what are you seeking
I think that's
reading?
definitely true. So that's definitely true for me too. There's some part of that resonates. I think early in my career, a lot of the people that I was looking to were people who had these other best-selling books because that's what I hoped to do. So, that's who I was quoting, but I think it's for a different reason than who I'm quoting now. I was quoting them because I was like at some deep level in my brain trying to figure out how did they do this? And, hoping that by reading those books, I could somehow soak up the magic of what it took to write a best-selling book. So that was maybe driven for a different reason. It was more like hoping that you could achieve that status level rather than now. I love like that Gene Roddenberry quote that you read or the Christopher Alexander one. I love quotes like that are, well, first of all, they're almost passages, not really quotes. But secondly, I have put some quotes in 3, 2, 1 that have been like, be the change you wish to see in the world, Gandhi, but I am generally not looking for quotes like that. Like I want something that you read it and it's like deep and interesting and different. It's practical and you can immediately see how it applies to your life, but it is something that ideally 99% of people are like, I've never read this, like I haven't even seen this. It's not a popular quote. I don't even know where he got this from. So I really like stuff like that now. And I'm just increasingly looking for it.
Something that's interesting to me that I notice is there's a lot of letters, speeches, sources like the Paris Review.
Yeah.
There's these unique places that you've been able to kind of curate or types of material you've been able to curate that foster that kind of unique find.
Well, some of this is really intentional and a little bit specific to 321 and what I'm trying to do with it. But I want a broad range of ideas and I want a broad diversity of sources. And, the most surface level, obvious version of that is we want a good split of male to female sources. I actually think we can do way better than that and that there's a much deeper way to think about it. One of the problems when you start putting quotes into newsletters is that the vast majority of quotes are a quote is only possible. It's only possible for you to read a quote if it's been written down.
Yeah.
And the main people that write things down are writers. And so you end up with a bunch of quotes that are all from writers. And I actually want quotes that are from scientists and researchers and engineers and computer programmers and all these other farmers. Like I've had a couple quotes from farmers and stuff, priests, people that are not sources you would usually come across. The reason for doing some of those interviews or speeches or letters is that that's where people like that write. They don't write books or articles as much. And so I'm looking for sources that have different groups in them. So that's one reason that stuff like that shows up.
So as a little hidden gem, is there a place on your site where you have all the speeches that you've had transcribed and that you have there? Or are they just like hyperlinked from?
I kind of have two different things happening. So in 321, some of the quotes are from speeches, but obviously many of them are not. And of course, if you just go to jamesclear.com and click on newsletter, there's all the archives of the issues. But then I also have this like kind of separate pet project that I do, which is whenever I come across an interesting speech, I'll get it transcribed and then I'll put the transcript up. I think if you search like James Clear great speeches, the page will come up. But it's just, I think the title on the page is great talks that people have never heard or that most people have never heard. And so it's just intended to be really insightful speeches that are not Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
And if you're a reader like me and like I have a hard time retaining spoken information, which is ironic that I love podcasting so much. I love reading transcripts of things. And so it's just a great play. Like if you only read that for the next 6 months or however many there are, one a week for the next 6 months, you probably have more new ideas even than subscribing to like every newsletter for that amount of time. We're running out of time here. So there's two things I want to talk about before we wrap up. The first one is your inputs don't just magically translate to outputs. You actually have quite a system for it. You have like I won't say quite a system. You have a system for it and it's intentional. And so I wondered if you could just spend a couple minutes talking about the system for translating your inputs into usable potential outputs later.
I try to keep it as simple as possible, but it starts by reading widely and trying to read, good things or select interesting material, which is what we were just talking about. And then whenever I'm reading something, if I'm reading something really good and by good, I mean, it's relevant to what I'm working on at the time, or it's like sparking ideas for me. Sometimes like there's one book in particular I can think of I was reading a couple months ago and I had trouble getting through a page because it would spark so many concepts for me. It was just related to what I was writing about at the time. A treatise on efficacy, I think is what it's called. It's basically, I
love it. It's perfect.
It's a book that you've never heard of. And in fact, you are very unlikely to hear about it because it was actually written in French originally. And then this professor translated it. And it's basically this person's thoughts on strategy. And for whatever reason, I was in the mindset where like what they were saying was very relevant to what I was working on. So anyway, but when it goes well, it's like that. So I'm reading along and then like it just sparks a thought and I'm like, I got to write that down. And then I'll read some more and then another one comes. And so I'm just like, things are just bubbling up. And I pretty much every thought that I have, I just dump it into Asana. So I just create a new task for each one. So I'll just, and usually I'm just writing down a quick note for me to remember. Sometimes it'll be like an actual paragraph, but most times it's like 1, 2, 3 sentences. Write that down, boom, add the task, it's there. Then Occasionally, probably not as often as I should, but sometimes I do it each day. Sometimes I do it each week. I'll go through Asana, and whenever I dump something in, I label it at the front. So like I might say for 3-2-1, for example, if I think it's something that could be a potential idea, I'll just write ideas and then I'll write the thing. Or if I think it could be a good quote, I'll say quotes and then I'll put the thing in. Or question, same way. And so then I go back into Asana and I just search for all the things that have quote at the beginning of it. And so now I have like, let's say 8 things that I've read from the last week. And then I take all of those and I dump those quotes into a spreadsheet. And I have one central holding ground for everything in 3-2-1. It's just one big spreadsheet. It has 3 tabs, 1 tab for ideas, 1 tab for quotes, 1 tab for questions. And it all gets dumped in there. And then about once a year, I will go through each tab and kind of like trim the stuff, because that was just my first pass. So now I'm like looking and saying, okay, I want to cut those 5, like those aren't good enough anymore. And then I'll come through some stuff that I found like months ago and I'll be like, oh, that's really good. I should use that next week. And so as I go through the spreadsheet, I'm doing like a second round of filtering and I'm pulling the ones that I like to the top of the sheet. And so what I end up with now, like this is the current state I was working on 3-2-1 yesterday, is the current state of the spreadsheet. I would say I have at least 6 to 8 quotes that I really like right now. And that I feel like this is going to be the next 3 to 4 weeks of the newsletter. And those 6 to 8 are at the top. And then beneath that, I have, I think like 700 other quotes that I've found. And I just need to keep going through those. And then there are other considerations that come into play. Like I was mentioning, what kind of sources, or have we run a lot from authors recently? And now I need to run one from a scientist or, whatever. But that's generally how it works. The quotes and the questions and the PS. Oh, I have 4 tabs. There's the PS tab, of course. The quotes, the questions, and the PS statements. Those are pretty straightforward. The ideas are easily the hardest part of the whole newsletter. It's actually interesting. I intentionally chose this format. I thought 3-2-1 was a good idea. I think it's actually turned out to be a better idea than I imagined it would be. And it's a very digestible format. It's really easy to understand. People like it. They like sharing it. And it's also been replicated a lot by other newsletters. But I intentionally did something at the start, which is I could have said 3 quotes, 2 questions, and 1 idea, rather than 3 ideas, 2 quotes, and 1 question. It could have been something like that. But the quotes are the easiest part to replicate. Anybody can pull a quote. Now, there's a question at, how good is the quote and at what level are you doing it? But that's a pretty easy part to replicate. The questions, I think a lot of people don't realize that I write the questions. A lot of them just think like, I don't know, it's some question bank they could copy and paste and use in their own newsletter or whatever. But it's not as hard to do that part because you only need 1. But to come up with 3 good ideas each week is actually much harder than you would think. It might not be that hard for a week or 2 or a month, but you get like 7 months into this and you're like, there's some weeks where it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to come up with 3 genuinely good ideas. And I did that intentionally. It's harder for me, but it's also harder to replicate. Like at some level, you can copy the format of 3-2-1 if you want, but you can't actually copy it because you can't be me. And so it's my version of 3-2-1.
It's like Georgia football,
Yeah. Oh man.
I just had to add that dig in there. Anyways, inside jokes about stupid things that don't actually matter, but lots of people care about.
Anyway, that's my process. That's what the process of producing the newsletter each week looks like.
Yeah, I love that. I'm intentionally refraining from talking about what your future big projects are, but I know we'll hear about them eventually. So I have 3 questions to wrap up, kind of maybe like a little bit of rapid fire. So pace your answers accordingly. What is a question that you've always wanted someone to ask you in a conversation like this on a podcast and Q&A after a talk that no one's ever actually asked you that you'd like to answer, if any?
A really hard question to answer on the spot, but one thing I feel like nobody ever asks about, but is actually a big part of how all this works for me, is how do the things that you create build upon each other? Nobody ever asked that, but it's a huge part of how I think about the business. I read a book, and so I write down notes and put them in that 3-2-1 spreadsheet. And some of those get put in the newsletter, and then some of them get shared on Twitter. So the book feeds the newsletter feeds Twitter. Eventually, some of those ideas, the ones that perform well, get turned into quote pages on Instagram, and they get posted there. So now Twitter and Instagram are growing, and we use the growth on social media to occasionally mention 3-2-1 and drive new people back to the newsletter. So now the social websites are driving new subscribers to the newsletter. because the newsletter and social media are all growing together, we mention atomic habits in those things in soft ways and subtle ways each week, and that drives book sales. The book inside has multiple calls to action to download PDFs and extra resources. And the people who do that join the newsletter and get on the email list. And so now the book is driving more subscribers. And what you end up with is just this web of assets that are all working together and they're all feeding each other. And it's like they all just keep passing people back and forth. And somebody can come in through any one of those avenues. If you're an Instagram person, maybe you come in that way. If you don't have any social media accounts, but you like reading books, maybe you come in through Atomic Habits. But there are all these entry points and they all end up like building and coalescing together. And collectively, you end up with this huge snowball and the brand just keeps compounding and growing and growing. And that stuff doesn't happen by accident. And I think it's a really important strategic part of the process that people almost never talk about. But if you can get it working well, it really can be a powerful factor.
Yeah, there's almost like an after dark episode that I want to do with you that's just the strategies that you've used over time, not because they're the strategies other people should use, but they illuminate the way you think about things. You know, it's like the book promotion, the way you used to syndicate your content across multiple platforms when that was working. And
the strategies change, but the principles are always the same.
Exactly.
And the person who has the principles can choose the right strategy for the moment. And the person who doesn't have the principles is left just copying the strategies they see other people doing. And so they're always two steps behind the leaders.
Yep. Yeah, I love that. It's almost like a way of thinking, a systemic way about thinking about funnels. Like Donella Meadows would be proud of you because, you know, people want to teach a one-way funnel. And in fact, it's a web, and it's a very it's more reflective of how nature works and how systems work. I think it's fascinating. Okay, I got two more for you. Another one of these books I probably wouldn't have read or appreciated 10 years ago was called, by an author named Pam Houston, called Deep Creek, Finding Hope in the High Country. And it's about this property, this ranch she bought up in the Colorado High Country. It became the place she called home. She lived there alone for a long time.
I think she's another Denison grad.
I think you're right. I noticed that actually. Yeah. So my two favorite memoirists so far, and I'm just getting into the genre, have James Clear connections. One from Columbus, one from Denison.
Yeah. Don't call it a pattern.
Yeah, right. She tells a story. Anyways, I won't tell the whole story, but basically she used this phrase, and I was on a plane and I just started bawling, and like crying is a skill I've had to build because it was so beaten out, not like literally beaten out of me, but like psychologically beaten out of me when I was little.
You're just a little emotionally stunted man.
That's right. And we're finally coming around to the full breadth of everything I have inside.
Yes, you're blossoming into your full self.
It's going to, there's a whole diatribe on that like I've had to come back to myself so that I can do the kind of creative work that I'm actually capable of. But this quote or this phrase was an unbearably beautiful future. And I read that quote and I was like, I'm going to name something that eventually. And I think it might be the name of
your next kid.
Memoir I'm working on. My next kid. But I think everyone has a version of the future they're trying to build that is their version of an unbearably beautiful future. Like that would be so amazing. It's almost hard to admit that's what I want because it's hard to imagine things being that good, either for myself or for the world. And so I'm just curious, like, if you think about the long arc of the work that you're doing and the impact you're trying to make and the change you're trying to drive in the world, to create something better, to create an unbearably beautiful future for you and others, what is that change that you're trying to make through your work?
I don't know. It's hard to self-assess how big of an impact your work makes. I think I have been surprised by how big of an impact the concepts in Atomic Habits have made. In a lot of ways, it has been a very beautiful future from 5 years ago to what, how people are using the book now and how they're making an impact. And I always tried to be useful and wanted to produce something that was valuable with the work. But I don't know that I started out with such a grand ambition as to create this, unbearably beautiful future for the universe or whatever. Like I wanted it to be the best book that had been written on habits. I wanted it to be useful for people. I wanted it to provide value, but I think I failed to appreciate how far it could spread or how much people could utilize those ideas. So with that as a backdrop, I think what I am feeling right now is I just want to do something else to that level of quality. How far it spreads and how useful it is, I probably don't really get a say. But if I can try to make something that's as useful as that, if I can try to do it at that high of a quality bar, then a lot of good things are going to happen as a side effect. As far as me personally, I think it would be a lot of fun to help other authors create whatever their atomic habits is. I think that would be fun. I love talking about that stuff and working with authors and talking about the concepts and the positioning for their books and the marketing plan and the strategy for launching it and how to frame it up so that it reaches the most people and all of that. To me, that stuff doesn't feel like work. That just feels like fun. And I think we could say the big grand ambition there is to increase the distribution of great ideas in the world. And so if I could help do that, I think that would be a cool thing worth striving for.
Yeah, I hear you say that sometimes, that like most wisdom per word in your newsletter and spreading great ideas, it's like building on that whole original TED idea. I love that.
When I was younger and, we talked about, I considered going to medical school. And it's interesting to think about the difference between those two arcs. A doctor is very high touch, very high impact. They literally could save someone's life or at least make a very meaningful difference in their patients' lives. There's a limit on the number of patients you can see throughout your career. Like you're probably, you might be able to see in the thousands. You can see tens of thousands. That sounds like a stretch. Definitely not seeing hundreds of thousands of people. So there's a limit on how many people you can impact, but you could potentially impact them in a very big way. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got something like what I'm doing now, where, Atomic Habits has sold 15 million copies in 5 years. Very high scale, very broad impact. I would say, or very broad reach, but pretty low impact. If somebody, like I just had a woman message me yesterday and say, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm up at 7 a.m. I'm going for a run. I credit this half marathon that I'm running to, the running habit that Atomic Habits helped me build. And that's very nice of her to say. But if we're being honest, like how much credit should I get really for her doing that? Like she did all the work. She woke up, she ran she's running the half marathon. Like now maybe the book provided a seed of inspiration at the right time, or maybe it gave her a strategy or a blueprint to follow that she didn't have before. And that helped make it possible. So it's not that it didn't play any role, but I think compared to what a doctor does, pretty low impact, but it reaches a lot more people. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about. I think it's like many things. I'm not saying one is better or worse, but what I think I've realized is that for me and my personality, in a lot of ways, I kind of like the second version. I said for whatever combination of reasons, I seem to be good at that version. And so maybe that's the way that I make my contribution, and other people make their contributions differently. And the world it's a big world and we need all of them, but that's a good place for me to live. And I don't know, it just gives you an interesting frame for thinking about the type of change you're trying to make and the type of contribution you're trying to make.
Yeah, it really does. It makes me think about like the thing I enjoy about my coaching work is that it's deep with each person. Yeah. And the thing I enjoy about podcasting and writing is that it has breadth that can reach many people. Yeah. And so I want both. The reframe or additional offering I would have to you about the role the book plays in people's lives is that I think that in some ways, it is an invitation for people to become more fully the thing they're already capable of being, but haven't yet realized. And sometimes people just need that mirror. They need the time to reflect. And I think the book is providing that invitation to people. And so, should you get credit for that? I don't know, but certainly, you're opening the door that people are walking through. Okay, my last question. This whole conversation has been about who have you become over time? What has shaped you? How do you do your work? What made this possible? Like what you have done in the world to this point. I'm curious for where you are right now and what you see in yourself. Who are you now becoming? Who are you working on becoming?
How successful I am or am not at this is, TBD. The first thought that came to mind is I hope I'm becoming someone more generous. For whatever combination of reasons, I've been afforded this very fortunate position that I'm in right now, both in terms of access, in terms of reach, in terms of finances, in terms of a lot of things. So my kind of feeling is like, all right, great. What are you going to do with it? Like how are you going to turn that into something meaningful and contribute something valuable? In a lot of ways, I'm still trying to figure that out. I don't know that I have an answer to it right now, but if I think about what I'd like to becoming more generous, or doing something that is generous. I think on the surface, the easy answers to that are like philanthropy and charity and stuff like that. But if you take the word generous more broadly, it can mean a lot of things. And there's probably even not that of course, giving to charity is great, but there probably is a better answer. if you sit and think for a while about what it would mean to do something really generous. So I don't have an answer, but that's where I'd like to go with it.
Well, that's part of becoming something, I think, is not yet having the answer. But yeah, it's almost like it's not an action to take, but a way of being.
Yeah.
And there's a difference
beautiful,
between
actually.
those things.
I like that. To live in a generous way feels right. So much of your early career, and I don't think this is unique to me in any way, and I'm not even sure that it's wrong, but you're trying to make your way. And so it is very self-centered, almost by requirement. You're trying to build your skills, you're trying to gain relationships, you're trying to gain access, you're trying to create something new. And you spend a lot of time thinking about yourself. And now we've got this growing family, have all this opportunity. I think it'd be good to shift a little bit and think, of course, throughout all this, I've been thinking a lot about the readers and that, but maybe you can broaden it a little bit more. I'm going to offer one final thing before we close. So I don't know what the name of this assessment was, but I was giving a talk the other day, and the speaker before me put it up on screen. I thought it was interesting. I think it comes from a researcher in Europe, but it basically divides your life onto 3 dimensions. Okay. So the first dimension is past, present, future. The second dimension is negative, neutral, positive. And the third dimension is others, team, and self. And the question is, if your brain has like a primary mode where you spend most of your time on each of these 3 dimensions, what would you choose? And so if for the particular speaker, he said, I think I am usually, I'm usually future, positive, and team. He was the CEO. And so he's spending a lot of time thinking about how can we go where we want to go and build what we want to build. But he said, I have a secondary mode that I can get into where I am often past, negative, team. What mistakes did we make? How did we screw up? What was the problem here? Why didn't somebody take responsibility for what they wanted, and so on. I think for myself, I spend a lot of time probably in the future, positive self mode. I spend a lot of time thinking about what do I want to create next? How can it be something valuable? How can it contribute something? And so on. There are 2 takeaways that I have from that. The first is, at no point did I think, I spend a lot of time in the present mode. So that's kind of interesting. And I think anybody with young kids will tell you how fast it goes. And I would probably if I think about what I'm trying to become, I'd probably like to spend a little bit more time in the present mode. And then the second thing is, I have spent a lot of time, again, somewhat out of necessity, thinking about where I want the business to go. And in my case, the business is me and it's this brand. So it's just a lot of time spent about what am I creating? Where am I going? And so on. As you shift into this period of increasing family life, maybe it's a little bit less about me and a little bit more about the team. And that might be one example of what it means to live in a generous way. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting framework, and figured it'd be a good.
Can I offer something back? If we were like in coaching, I'd say, what if it's possible to be both at one time, to be something in your work and something with your family? Yeah. And I wonder what it would be like to live in the future positive in your work and in the present positive with family, and have those coexist.
I like it. There's always a third option. There is no spoon. It's beautiful.
And on that note, we'll wrap it up. James, man, I love you. I appreciate you. Great conversation. And I know people get a lot from it.
All right, brother. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right, that wraps up episode 1 of Good Work, my new show. This is Barrett Brooks, your host. This podcast is produced by my friends at Podcast Royale. I hope that you loved this first episode, and I hope you got a taste for what you can expect from future episodes. There's 2 things I want to point you to before I go. The first thing is a couple places you can find more of James' work. And the second thing is I want to give you a little preview of the next episode so that you know what to expect. To find James online, if you haven't already, which I seriously doubt at this point, you can find him at jamesclear.com, where you can get his newsletter. He also just released a brand new app in the Apple App Store called Atoms. It's a habit formation app based on all the principles from Atomic Habits. So it's really built to try and help you form great habits in your own life, whether you want to write, eat well, work out more, or maybe something else entirely. So check that out, give it a review, and let me know what you think about it. Also, James is a great follow on Twitter, so be sure to look him up there. He's very active there and on Instagram with sharing content both from his newsletter and original thoughts. So check him out on social media as well. Now, next episode, I'm going to have a guest on. Her name is Hannah Ritchie. Hannah is the deputy editor at an organization called Our World in Data. And Our World in Data has been probably one of the most trusted sources of data-driven facts in the world, especially since the coronavirus pandemic took off. They became one of the go-to places that people could find reliable data on cases for COVID around the world. But that's not all they do. They provide data on things like climate change, the energy transition, poverty rates around the world, vaccination rates, and any of a number of other issues. Their goal is to provide the basis for fact so that people in leadership, government, and everywhere else can debate what to do about those facts. Hannah's also the author of a book called Not the End of the World. It's a data-driven guide to climate change. And we have an awesome conversation about how she became an environmentalist and how she overcame her deep despair over the climate change issue and learned to focus more on hope and optimism by taking action. I think you're really going to love that episode. It's actually available right now, so make sure to go listen to that one next. If you love this show, please make sure to subscribe and leave me a review if you're really feeling generous. I'll see you on the next episode.